Welcome to this episode of Intel Focus, the review series, where we dive into the world of OSINT, disinformation, and media literacy. Each episode reviews key reports and findings, including events around the world, offering in-depth analysis on topics like intelligence gathering, digital misinformation, investigative reports, and fact-checking. This podcast aims to promote ethical and responsible practices in intelligence and information sharing. In this episode of Intel Focus, the review series, we explore the surprising 2024 election results, with Donald Trump winning a second term. We analyze key factors such as voter demographics, economic impacts, trade policies, and geopolitical consequences.
All right, so, we asked you to send in some stuff about this election, and wow.
Yeah.
Wild, right? I mean, Donald Trump back in the White House for a second term.
Okay, crazy.
I don't think a lot of us saw that one coming.
Definitely a historic moment. I mean, he had the legal battles and those approval ratings. Remember how low they were after that whole Capitol riot thing. And yet here we are. Plus, this is actually the first time in over 130 years that a former president has actually come back to the White House.
It really makes you think about what it says about the state of things. You know what I mean? What's going on in the country. And don't forget, he's also 78.
Oh, yeah.
That's the oldest president, ever.
That's right. And, when you look back at other presidents who served at an advanced age, you start to see some patterns, like health concerns and stuff, and questions about their stamina and even potential for, shifts in power within their administrations. All things we might see again this time around. It's definitely something to keep in mind as we go through all this, when we look at his policies and decisions over the next 4 years.
Okay, so let's actually get into the details of the win. One thing that really jumped out at me from these articles was the exit poll data. It looks like women and minority voters didn't come out for Harris the way they did for Biden in 2020.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And there's no simple answer. Could be a few things, maybe all of them together. Maybe there wasn't that much enthusiasm for Harris herself. Or maybe it even shows a deeper shift in the political landscape since 2020. I mean, think about it. A lot has happened in 4 years.
Yeah.
We had all that economic uncertainty after the pandemic and the social unrest. Even the media landscape is changing. All this could have played a part in how people voted.
So it's not just about the candidates, but also about how the country's changed. People's priorities have shifted.
Exactly. To really get this election, we need to look beyond the surface. Look at what's shaping the political landscape, what's driving all of this.
And speaking of shaping the landscape, it wasn't just the presidency, right? They took the Senate, too.
Oh, yeah, they did. Gives them a lot of power to push their agenda. I think we can expect some pretty big changes, especially on things like immigration and taxes and the structure of the federal government. That could be interesting.
He talked a lot about retribution during the campaign. I'm a little nervous about what that's going to look like now that he's back.
Yeah, that retribution talk, a lot of people were raising their eyebrows at that. It's hard to say what it'll mean for, actual policy, but it definitely suggests a more aggressive approach, maybe even targeting political opponents or undoing stuff from the last administration.
So buckle up, everyone. Things are about to get interesting in Washington.
Well, I don't know about buckle up. It's not a roller coaster or anything. But I will say this is a big moment for the U.S., and we're just starting to see what it all means.
All right, fair enough. No roller coasters. But seriously, this election, it set shockwaves.
Oh, yeah.
Across the world. Even the financial markets are reacting.
Well, they always react to political change. It makes sense. We've seen the dollar surge. Some people are saying that's because they have confidence in his leadership. But there's also a lot of worry about what his trade policies are going to do.
Yeah, because even if a strong dollar is good for some parts of the economy, his stance on trade, especially with China, that could cause some serious tension internationally.
Exactly. His past actions on tariffs and trade deals, it's got people worried about trade wars, which could, totally disrupt markets globally. And that could mean price hikes here at home. And then there's how China will react. They've been watching this election very closely. Whatever they do next, well, it could have some really big consequences, geopolitically speaking.
Speaking of geopolitical consequences, what about Afghanistan? I thought it was interesting that after that messy withdrawal during his first term, he still had strong support, from Afghan Americans and even U.S. veterans. What do you make of that?
It does seem kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? But if you dig a little deeper, you see a lot of factors at play. For some Afghan Americans, maybe just wanting the war to end no matter how it happened, maybe that resonated with them. And for veterans, maybe his focus on veteran-specific policies, maybe that was more important than the controversy around the withdrawal.
It really shows you how, even in groups that seem unified on the surface, there can be so many different motivations and priorities.
For sure. And that complexity, that's what makes this whole thing so interesting. It's not just about, what happened in the election, but why. It's about understanding the motivations and the fears, the hopes, even the anxieties that drive how people vote.
Okay, so we've got this, this president who won, but he's old, and the country's divided. Everyone's trying to deal with all these changes, and the world is kind of holding its breath to see what happens next. Where do we even start with all this?
Well, I think first we just acknowledge how big this is. This isn't just another election. It could be a real turning point for the U.S. And if we want to know where we're going, we have to understand how we got here.
We were talking about how this election could be a turning point. And I think one of the first places we're seeing that is in the financial markets. All these articles, it's a pretty volatile picture.
Yeah, the markets hate uncertainty. And right now, there's a ton of it. We've got the surge in the dollar, which usually means people are confident in the economy. But then there's the whole question of his trade policies, That could really mess things up.
It's like everyone's waiting to see what he does next, especially when it comes to China. All this talk about tariffs and trade wars.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that trade wars, those aren't just ideas. They have real consequences.
Yeah.
Take the solar panel industry, for example. During his first term, those tariffs on imported solar panels, well, they made things more expensive for American companies and, regular people. And that actually slowed down the whole adoption of renewable energy.
So those tariffs, they kind of hurt the industries they were supposed to help.
In some cases, yeah. The idea is to make domestic goods more competitive, right? But it can backfire if it makes prices go way up or if it messes with global supply chains. And with China, it's even trickier because they're such a big part of the global economy.
And it's not just the economics either, right? His stance on Taiwan, that adds a whole other layer of tension geopolitically.
Absolutely. Taiwan is a huge flashpoint between the U.S. and China. Anything he does that looks like he's supporting Taiwan's independence, that could really provoke Beijing. We could see military exercises in the region, sanctions, even cyber attacks. It's a really delicate situation.
So we've got economic uncertainty, trade wars, and potential conflict in the Pacific.
Yeah.
How is this going to affect regular Americans?
Well, the most direct impact is probably going to be on our wallets. A trade war with China would probably mean higher prices on, almost everything. Electronics, clothing, you name it. And it could also mess with supply chains, so there might be shortages. Think back to the beginning of the pandemic, when everyone was trying to find toilet paper and hand sanitizer, a trade war could be like that.
So our wallets might take a hit?
Yeah.
And maybe some empty shelves at the store? Are there any good things about a second Trump term?
Well, it depends on your perspective. Some people say that his tough stance on trade negotiations is what we need to protect American jobs and intellectual property. And some might like his focus on deregulation. They think that could help some parts of the economy.
So for some people, it's a tough but necessary approach, putting America first, even if it means some short-term pain.
Exactly. But you could also argue that this approach could backfire later on. It could hurt relationships with our allies and end up hurting American businesses.
It's that classic debate, short-term gains versus long-term stability. And it feels like this election has just made the divisions in our country even worse.
That's one of the most worrying things about all of this. The polarization is so intense, it's not just about disagreeing on policies anymore. It feels like it's a clash of values, of how we see the world.
I read an article that talked about how Trump appeals to people who feel like they've been left behind by globalization and social change.
Yeah, we've seen that in a lot of countries, not just the U.S. People are disillusioned with the way things are. They feel like the system is rigged against them. Trump, with all that drain the swamp talk, he's made himself the champion of those people, the ones who feel forgotten.
So he's speaking for the people who feel like the political establishment isn't listening to them. But is there a risk that kind of talk could lead to more division, maybe even violence?
There's always that risk. When people feel like they're not being heard, through the normal channels, they might be more open to extreme ideas, or they might try to take things into their own hands. We've seen more political violence in the past few years, and this election has just made people more anxious about that.
It's a scary thought, that our political disagreements could lead to violence. What about other countries? How are they reacting to all this?
From what I've seen, it's a mix of worry and resignation. They've had 4 years to get used to his unpredictable style, but they're not exactly happy about it. They're worried about his America First agenda and what it means for global cooperation, on things like climate change, trade, and security.
So they're bracing themselves for more of the same, but maybe with higher stakes this time.
That seems to be the general feeling. There's this sense that the U.S. isn't as reliable a partner anymore, and that could mean more instability and conflict globally.
This is heavy stuff.
Yeah.
As we finish up this part of our deep dive, is there anything our listeners should be paying extra attention to in the next few weeks and months?
I think it's really important to watch what he does early on, his policies and who he appoints. That'll give us a sense of what he's prioritizing for this term. And watch how the markets react to his decisions, especially on trade and foreign policy. Oh, and pay attention to the people who disagree with him, both in the U.S. and in other countries. Understanding those criticisms and concerns, that's going to be crucial to facing the challenges ahead.
So basically, stay informed, stay engaged, and don't let the news cycle get to you.
Exactly. This is a marathon, not a sprint. It's going to be a long road, and it might get bumpy.
Okay, so we've spent the last couple parts looking at, right after the election, all the shock and the worry.
Yeah.
But I kind of want to look ahead now. What could this second term mean in the long run?
Well, one area where I think we could see some really big lasting changes is the courts. Remember, he appointed 2 conservative justices to the Supreme Court in his first term. And there's a good chance he'll get to appoint more now. That could change the balance of the court for, a whole generation, maybe even longer.
Yeah, and it's not just the Supreme Court, right? He's been appointing judges to those lower federal courts, too. What kind of impact could that have?
Well, those appointments, they can really affect the whole legal system. Everything from environmental stuff to voting rights to even criminal justice. It's not just about individual cases. It's about shaping how the law works for decades.
Makes you think about how these elections, they have consequences that last way beyond just the 4 years, right? What about the political system itself? Could a second Trump term actually change how American politics works?
It's possible, for sure. I mean, his presidency has been all about ignoring those traditional rules, pushing the limits of executive power. We've seen more polarization, less trust in institutions, even this blurring of what's true and what's not. The question is, will all that keep going? Will it get even worse in this next term?
And if it does, what does that mean for, democracy in America?
That's the big question, right? A healthy democracy needs people to agree on basic facts, to be willing to compromise, to respect the rule of law. When those things start to break down, that's when you get division and instability, maybe even authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
We can't ignore that.
It's a pretty serious thought. Let's zoom out a little, talk about the rest of the world. How could a second Trump term change America's place globally?
Well, we've already seen him moving away from multilateralism, working with other countries, and moving more towards this transactional approach to foreign policy. He likes those one-on-one deals, and he's not afraid to pull out of international agreements. So I think we'll probably see more of that, which could lead to a more fragmented world order.
So instead of taking the lead on things like climate change or global trade, the U.S. might become more isolationist.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. And remember, if the U.S. steps back from that leadership role, other countries will step in to fill the gap. The question is, who will those countries be? And what will their values and goals be?
It sounds like there are a lot of potential downsides, a lot of risk. But are there any opportunities here? Anything good that could come out of a second Trump term?
Well, one possibility is that, because his foreign policy is so unconventional, it could shake things up and lead to some breakthroughs. Remember when he engaged directly with North Korea? It was controversial, sure, but it did open up a dialogue that hadn't existed before. So maybe his willingness to break the mold could lead to some unexpected progress in other areas, too.
So it's not all bad news? Maybe there's still room for hope? Maybe even some good surprises?
Always. Always. History is full of unexpected turns. We can't know for sure what's going to happen, but we can learn from the past, analyze the present, and face the future with, a mix of caution and optimism.
I like that, caution and optimism. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what advice would you give our listeners as they try to make sense of all this, all this complexity and uncertainty?
Stay informed, stay engaged, and don't be afraid to ask the tough questions. Challenge your own assumptions, listen to different points of view, and be open to changing your mind. And most importantly, don't give up on the idea of a better future. We all have a part to play in creating that future, even if it's just by staying informed and caring about the things that matter to us.
That's a great point. And remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. It's up to all of us to keep talking about these things, to explore them more deeply, and to find ways to make a positive difference in our communities and beyond.
That's what it's all about. Curiosity, critical thinking, and wanting to make the world a better place.
Well said. So that wraps up our deep dive into the aftermath of the 2024 election. We've covered a lot, from the immediate reactions to what this could all mean in the long term. But the conversation doesn't stop here. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning. And we'll see you on the next deep dive.